The month of April can be a wild card weather-wise, and in the past week we have seen some ups and downs, from flooding rainfall to a hard freeze. And in this week's edition of the Climate Friday newsletter, we're going to break down just how normal it is to get heavy rainfall like this, as well as a late season frost and freeze. If you're not already subscribed, WTOL.com/email. That's the place to go for new climate related information each and every week sent straight to your inbox. So let's break down the numbers, both the spring freeze as well as the heavy rainfall. A whole host of weather impacts that were felt this week. Let's start things off by talking about the April cold. It really settled in at the start of the work week and the tail end of last week. Some of those overnight low temperatures took a while to drop, but by Monday, Tuesday, and into Wednesday, we had a trio of days that all featured a hard freeze. And we're going to be defining what a hard freeze is coming up in just a minute. We did have temperatures that were above freezing Saturday and Sunday, but then Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, all of which were in the middle 20s. Now, the coldest ever April day recorded was a single-digit day that occurred on April 7th of 1982, and that one's notable because it is the only time we have dropped to the single digits in the month of April. And obviously, we came well far away from achieving that record of 8 degrees on April 7th. So, how does a frost differ from a freeze and a hard freeze? Let's start things off by talking about a frost. Still very common during the month of April and even into May. This occurs when temperatures are below the 36-degree mark. And if you step outside and see the grass, you may see some frost as opposed to liquid dew that is developing on the grass. Typically with a frost, there are no major impacts to agriculture and no big impacts to your garden or to flowers as well. Now, a freeze, that is when temperatures drop below the 32-degree or freezing mark. And once we start to get into that territory, it is recommended that you cover up sensitive outdoor plants. Now, typically with a freeze just barely below freezing, say 30 to 31 degrees, there are no big impacts unless it is a very long duration type freeze, but we still do urge to cover up those sensitive outdoor vegetation. Now, a hard freeze, that is a different story. This is a sustained period below 28 degrees. Typically, a hard freeze is defined as at least, at the bare minimum, 1 full hour of sub 28 degree temperature readings, and that can be damaging and destructive to the early season bloom, especially if there's an earlier bloom than usual. Any buds that have opened on up can be destroyed as a result of a hard freeze, and this commonly impacts fruit trees, and even locally, sometimes the apple crop is affected if that bloom occurs earlier than usual and a hard freeze follows. Now, the last freeze of the season, it is very normal to have it during the month of April. In fact, our typical final freeze is April 26th, and our normal last frost, that typically occurs into early May. Now, keep in mind, frost is 36 degrees and freeze is below that 32-degree mark. Now, the record for the latest frost and freeze, that occurred on a historic day in June 11th of 1972, and that one's notable because it was not only our latest frost, but also the latest we have ever experienced freezing or 32-degree temperatures. Certainly unseasonable to go all the way into the season with that type of cold. Now, how does our normal frost and freeze differ across the area? This map shows the last freeze, at least normal, across northwest Ohio and lower Michigan. There are some local factors that do play a role into when we typically see that last freeze. Now, it is normally colder up in Hillsdale and Lenawee counties, and the final freeze of the year doesn't happen until the first week of May across parts of lower Michigan. That's likely not surprising due to the colder climate. Now, if you look up to the north and northeast in parts of Monroe County up towards Wayne County and Detroit, typically happens between April 11th and April 20th, which is interesting because it's a little bit earlier than most of northwest Ohio. Including the Toledo Metro, the bulk of the area sees that final freeze between April 21st and April 30th. So if you're wondering, how do this week's cold temperatures compare to a normal year? Climatologically, they are on point with what you can expect. Now, west of Toledo, there is a region from Fulton and Williams County down towards Putnam, Henry, and Defiance County that does see that normal last freeze between April 11th to April 20th, and that is pretty similar to what is experienced up in Monroe. So bottom line, you can expect that freeze to occur during the last week of April, but once you get into the month of May, it starts to become less and less common. Now, despite how cold it has been here locally, we always try to contextualize the weather with more of a global and national perspective in the Climate Friday newsletter. Across the world, it was the #2 ever recorded month of March. We're looking back on the data over the last month or so, and that data shows that it was not only the second warmest March globally, but the #1 warmest warmest ever in the continent of Europe. Now, compared to pre-industrial levels, temperatures were 1.6 degrees above average, and now that means that in the last 21 months, we have gone 20 of those months with temperatures at least 1.5 degrees above average compared to pre-industrial levels. So even though it's been cold here at home lately, keep in mind March was globally an unseasonably warm month. So that's the cold. What about the precipitation and the rainfall? April rainfall has been abundant so far. In fact, we are close to 3 inches of rain as of this recording Wednesday evening. And by the time you're watching this on Friday, it is very likely that we will have surpassed that 3-inch rainfall amount. Since the start of March, this is looking at the spring season thus far, 5.8 inches as of Wednesday evening. And again, that number is likely to be over half a foot by Friday afternoon when you're watching this video. So we are well above average in the rainfall department, and that rainfall surplus likely to continue into the month of April. It has been persistent with a historic rainfall on April 2nd that brought us 2.25 inches of rainfall. That wasn't quite the wettest ever April day on record, but it was awfully close. That caused rises in local rivers and area flooding. We got a little over 1/10 of an inch the following day. Not much on April 4th, but then another decent dose of rainfall occurred on April 5th. And finally, April 6th snapped that streak of wet weather. Now, the wettest ever April day on record might surprise you that we've never actually gotten 3 inches in one day. This occurred in 1977, late April on the 22nd, where we got almost 2.9 inches of rain. So our 2.27 that we achieved last week, not quite that record, but still very anomalous and very unusual compared to the wettest ever April day. Now, despite how rainy and cold it's been lately, the weather pattern is expected to turn a bit quieter and drier towards mid-month, and that also means the return of some sunnier weather conditions. However, we are expected to stay chillier than average, so stay tuned to the WTOL 11 weather team for updates on frost and freeze potential. Again, subscribe to that Climate Friday newsletter at WTOL.com/email. And as we round the corner from April, and May is going to be here before you know it, we'll continue to have the latest sent to your inbox every week.